A man who buried his heart 4 years ago, a blizzard that should have killed them, and a 3-year-old girl, no shoes, no coat, barely breathing, who looked up at a broken stranger and whispered one word that changed everything. What Jesse Hollowell finds sewn inside a dead man's letter will drag him into a war against a corrupt judge, a crooked lawman, and a banker who smiles in church on Sundays. But the real question isn't whether he can win. The question is, can a man who swore he'd never love again survive being needed this much? This channel is home to stories of the frontier tales of cowboys and wide-open skies, of love forged in hardship, the unbreakable bond between a parent and a child, and the quiet, stubborn kindness that holds broken people together. Sometimes the family that finds you in a storm is the one you were always meant to have, and the only thing standing between a closed-off heart and a second life is the courage to let 3 little girls knock on your door. If this story moved something in you, don't let it go quietly. Leave a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. Like this video so more people find their way here. Share it with someone who needs to believe in goodness right now. And subscribe so you never miss the next story. See you around the fire.
He thought she was already gone. That was the first thing that crossed Jesse's mind. The child in his arms was limp, not breathing, not anything. Barely 3 years old, her thin cotton dress was frozen solid to skin that had turned from blue to a terrible lifeless gray. Jesse had seen cattle freeze right where they stood this winter, even saw a man's fingers turn black and snap clean off like dead twigs. It was January of 1887, out in the Wyoming Territory. It was the winter folks would later call the Great Die-Up, the winter that took nearly everything. But he was damned if he was going to let it take this child. He smacked her back, and he did it hard, harder than a man should ever strike something so small. Still nothing. He flipped her over, covered her small mouth with his, and pushed air into lungs no bigger than his own 2 fists. Her little chest rose, then fell, then rose again. Finally, a cough rattled out of her, weak and wet. But it was real. "Papa," she whispered. Jesse's hands froze. His whole world just stopped right there. That word said in that exact same voice, high and small and full of trust. It was the same sound, the same way his Rosie used to say it, running across the yard with her arms stretched out wide. "Papa, Papa, catch me." Rosie had been gone for 4 years now. A fever had burned through her in just 3 days. Jesse had held her when she passed, felt her body go still, felt the weight of her shift from a living soul to something that was gone. And now some stranger's child was speaking the word that had died right alongside his own daughter. He told himself to put it away. Not now. He shoved that memory down deep, pulled the baby tighter inside his coat and felt her heartbeat. It was weak. It was wrong. But it was there. That is when a voice cut through the wind behind him. "Mister, please do not hurt her." Jesse spun around. 2 more children were standing there in the snow. The oldest looked to be 9, maybe 10 years old, with auburn hair matted down with ice and blue-gray eyes that looked like they had seen 30 hard years. She had planted her feet wide, standing between Jessie and the younger girl with her small fists balled up, ready to fight a man 3 times her size in a blizzard that would surely kill her inside of an hour. The smaller one hid behind her, about 6 years old, with her blonde hair plastered to her head and big, empty brown eyes. She was clutching a piece of crumpled, dirty paper to her chest, like it was the most precious doll in the world. "I ain't hurting nobody," Jesse said, his voice rough. "This little one needs to get warm. Now, who are y'all?" The older girl ignored his question and asked one of her own. "Is this the Hollowell Ranch?" Jessie stood a little straighter. "How do you know that name?" "Is it or ain't it?" she shot back. "It is." "Then we're in the right place." The girl's voice trembled. She swayed a little but caught her balance. "We just need one night, sir. Just one night and we'll be on our way." I swear on it. You ain't going anywhere tonight. Not a one of you. Jesse jerked his head toward the ranch house. Smoke was pouring thick from the chimney, the only sign of warmth in a frozen world. Now get moving before this storm decides to take us all. The older girl grabbed the younger one's hand and they followed him. The little one never made a peep. Not one whimper, not a single word, just those vacant brown eyes staring off at nothing. Jesse kicked the front door open and a wave of heat rushed out to meet them. Lola came out of the kitchen. She was 58 years old with her gray hair tied back, and she had worked this ranch for 20 years. She was there when Rosie was born, and she was there when they put her in the ground. She saw the baby in his arms and crossed herself. Dios mío, how long has she been out in this? I don't know. Found him down by the fence line. Jesse carefully laid the little girl, Birdie, on the rug near the fireplace. She's burning up, got a bad fever. Lola's hands were already at work, peeling off the wet clothes and wrapping her in warm blankets. She put her palm on Birdie's forehead, and her expression darkened. This is 103 at least, maybe more. She looked up at Jesse. I need hot water, chamomile, and every last blanket in this house. Now go. Jesse went to the kitchen, pumped water, and set the pot on the stove. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. The older girl had followed him. She stood right in the kitchen doorway, just watching him, sizing him up, her eyes noting every exit, every window, and anything she could grab to use as a weapon. Jesse knew that look. He'd seen it on wild mustangs the day before they either broke for you or tried to kill you. Sit down, he told her. There's stew on the stove and bread in the box. Feed yourself and your sister. The girl didn't sit. She served the younger one first, setting a bowl in front of her and watching to make sure she ate. Only after that did she get a bowl for herself. But even as she ate, her eyes never once left Jesse. What's your name? Jesse asked. Eliza. Eliza May Colulton. She nodded her head toward the little one. That's Hannah. She doesn't talk. Is she sick too? No, sir. Eliza's voice became flat, empty. She just stopped talking. About 4 months ago. Jesse glanced over at Hannah. The 6-year-old was eating with just one hand. Her other hand was still holding that crumpled paper tight against her chest. She hadn't let go of it for a second. Not while walking through the snow, not when she sat down, and not even now. What happened 4 months ago? Jesse asked. Eliza's spoon stopped midway to her mouth. She lowered it back to the bowl and looked at Jesse with those old, weary eyes. Our uncle happened. From the front room, Lola cried out, Mr. Hollowell, you need to come here now. Her voice was wrong. Jesse recognized that tone. He had heard it one other time, 4 years ago, when Lola was undressing Rosie for a fever bath and discovered the rash that meant scarlet fever. He walked quickly to the front room. Lola had pulled back Birdie's blanket. The baby's little arms were bare. Jesse saw the bruises, old ones that had turned yellow and green, in the clear shape of fingers on both her arms and across her ribs. Somebody had grabbed this child, squeezed her and shaken her, not just once, but many times. His jaw clenched tight. I've seen these marks before, Lola said softly. My sister, down in Guadalajara. Her husband would do the same. Grab her when he was drunk, shake her when she cried. She paused. My sister did not make it, Mr. Hollowell. She was only 19. Jesse stood up and walked back to the kitchen. Eliza was watching him. She knew exactly what he had just seen. She had been waiting for him to see it. Your uncle did that to Birdie? It wasn't really a question. Eliza didn't take it as one. Yes, sir. To all of you? Eliza simply pulled up her sleeve. There were faded bruises, the thin lines of belt marks, and one round burn scar put there on purpose with a cigar. Jesse felt a white-hot rage swell up in his chest like a physical blow. It was the old anger, his father's anger, the fury that ran in his blood and just waited for moments like this one. He gripped the edge of the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and forced that rage back down into the dark place where he kept it chained. "Who is your uncle?" "Edgar Prescott." The name hung in the air as heavy as a tombstone. Edgar Prescott, the banker over at Elhorn Creek, who sat in the front pew of the church every Sunday. He held the notes on half the businesses in town, shook your hand like a preacher, and smiled like a man who had never done a single wrong thing in his life. "How long have you been living with him?" "6 months, since Papa passed on back in June." Jessie pulled out a chair and sat down right across from her. "So, how did you three end up at my gate in the middle of a blizzard 50 miles from town?" Eliza looked over at Hannah. The little girl wasn't eating anymore. She had put her spoon down and was carefully unfolding the crumpled paper on the table. It was not a letter. It was a drawing. Done with charcoal on a piece of brown wrapping paper. It showed a house. A man stood in the doorway holding something in his hand. It was a belt. And in the corner, 3 small figures were huddled together in fear. Jessie stared at the drawing, a knot tightening in his throat. "Hannah drew that last week," Eliza said. "She draws everything she can't say out loud. She's got 40 more just like it in her coat pocket." Jessie looked at Hannah. The 6-year-old was now adding something else to the picture. A 4th figure, bigger than the others, was standing between the man with the belt and the 3 small children shielding them. She had given this 4th person a hat, a cowboy hat, just like his. Jessie had to look away. He turned back to Eliza. "How did you find me?" "Papa told me to right before he died. He gave me a letter. He said if anything ever happened, if Uncle Edgar ever hurt us, I was supposed to find you." She took a shaky breath. "He said you were his brother." The kitchen fell completely silent. The stove popped and crackled. The wind howled outside the walls. But inside that room, the entire world had stopped moving. His mouth hung open. Then it snapped shut. Then it fell open again. "Samuel." Eliza just nodded. Samuel Colton. Samuel Prescott. Samuel, or whatever last name he was using these days. It was Jessie's younger brother. The one who had packed up and left 18 years ago, changed his name, and just plain vanished. He never sent a single letter, never made a phone call. Jessie had cut him out of his life like a diseased limb. He had not said that name in years, had taught himself not to even think it. Samuel was gone. He was gone long before he died, and somehow even more gone after. And now here were his daughters sitting in Jessie's own kitchen, eating his stew and carrying his family name on a piece of paper in a dead man's handwriting. "Your father," Jessie said, the words coming out slow. "He told you about me?" Eliza's voice got real soft. "He talked about you all the time. About when y'all were boys, about the ranch, about how you always protected him from your daddy when he got to drinking." She took a breath. "Papa said you were the best man he ever knew. He said if anything ever happened to him, you were the only soul in this whole world he trusted to look after us." Jessie had to stand up. He walked over to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. His own reflection looked back at him, all gaunt and hollowed out. It was the face of a man who had not had a good night's sleep in 4 long years. Samuel trusted him. Samuel, who took off without a single word. Who did not even show up for Catherine's funeral. Who did not send so much as a flower when Rosie died. That Samuel still trusted him. Then why in the world did he not come to me? Why not come himself? Why send you 3? "Because he is dead, Mr. Hollowell." "I know he is dead. I mean before all this. Why did he not come back in 18 years? Why not just one time?" Eliza was quiet for a good long while. Then she said something that hit Jessie harder than a mule kick. "He wrote to you 3 times. You just never wrote back." Jessie turned clean around. "I never got any letters." Eliza just stared at him, and something in her eyes changed. It was fear, but not of him. It was fear of something else. Something she was piecing together, right there in her head. Papa said the same thing. He said maybe Jesse burned them. But then he said, or maybe someone made sure he never got them. Someone who did not want us talking to each other. Edgar. Eliza did not have to say a word. Her face said it all. The old clock on the wall just kept on ticking. Outside, the winter storm was beating against the windows. From the front room, Bertie let out a cough. It was a small sound, wet and just plain wrong. Lola showed up in the kitchen doorway right then. The baby's fever is breaking a little. I reckon she will make it through the night. But Mr. Hollowell, she stopped. That child has not been fed right in weeks. You can count every one of her ribs, all their ribs for that matter. Jesse just nodded. Make up the guest room, all three of them together. Lola looked over at Eliza. Come on, mija. Bring your sister. Y'all are safe here tonight. Eliza stood up and took Hannah's hand. Hannah gathered up her drawing real careful, folded it, and pressed it back against her chest like a treasure. They followed Lola on down the hall. At the doorway, Eliza stopped and turned back around. Mr. Hollowell. Yeah. Uncle Edgar will come looking for us. He always does. He found us in Cheyenne in 2 days. Found us in Laramie in 3. She paused. He's got the town marshal in his pocket. He's got the judge, too. He will come right here, and he will have papers, and he will put on a big smile. Everyone will believe him, because that is what he does. He makes people believe things. Jesse looked her square in the eyes. Let him come. You do not understand. Eliza's voice dropped to a whisper. The last family that tried to help us. The Hendersons in Cheyenne. She trailed off. Their barn burned down a week after we left. Their horses were still inside. Jesse felt a cold that had nothing to do with the storm settled deep into his bones. It came from the truth in what this little girl was telling him. I ain't the Hendersons, Eliza. No, sir, you ain't. And that is what scares me. Because Papa said you were stubborn enough to fight back. And the people who fight Edgar are the ones who get hurt the worst. She turned then and disappeared down the hall. Jesse heard the guest room door close. He heard Lola's soft, gentle voice, the sound of blankets being straightened, of children settling into a bed that was not theirs, but was warm and dry and safe for now. Jesse sat all alone in his kitchen, the coffee getting cold in his hand. He thought about Samuel, the little boy who used to trail him around the ranch like a shadow, the boy who would climb into Jesse's bed during thunderstorms, the brother he had shielded from their father's fists 100 times, maybe 1,000. He thought about the last time he ever saw him. It was a Tuesday morning. Samuel was 20 years old, standing at the gate with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Jesse, at 27, just watched from the porch. He was too proud to ask him to stay, and too dang angry to say a proper goodbye. Samuel had looked back just one time, then turned and walked away. 18 years. No letters that ever reached him, no visits, not a single word. Not until 3 little girls showed up in the middle of a blizzard, carrying his name like a prayer. Around midnight, Jesse went to check on them. He could not help himself. He opened the guest room door real slow and quiet. The fire in the hearth was burning low. Bertie was right in the middle of the bed. Hannah was curled up around her, protective even in her sleep. And Eliza, well, Eliza was not asleep at all. She was sitting straight up, her back against the headboard, watching that door. The second Jessie appeared, her hand slipped under the pillow and came back out holding a kitchen knife she must have grabbed from the table. Easy now, Jessie said softly. It is just me. Eliza lowered the knife, but she did not put it away. Do you need something? Came to check on Bertie. She's breathing better. Fever's down some. Good. Jesse leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. You do this every night? Sit up and keep watch? Somebody has to. The words were so simple, but they were devastating. 9 years old, and she had made herself the guardian, the watchman, the one who did not sleep so the others could. Jessie looked at her, at this child wearing exhaustion like a second skin. You can sleep tonight, Eliza. I will watch. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to. I want to. Jessie paused for a second. When was the last time you really slept? I mean real sleep, not the kind where you keep one eye open. Eliza was quiet. Then she said, I do not remember. Jessie pulled the old wooden chair from the corner, set it right by the door, and sat down. Go on to sleep, Eliza. She just stared at him, that knife still clutched in her hand. For 30 seconds, maybe a full minute. Then something just broke behind her eyes. Something she had been holding together with nothing but pure will for 6 long months. Her chin started to tremble. She bit her lip hard to stop it. If I sleep, she whispered, if I close my eyes, you will still be here when I wake up? I will be right here. I ain't going nowhere. Eliza looked at him for one more long moment. Then she slid the knife back under the pillow, lay down, and pulled her sisters in close. She was sound asleep in 2 minutes, like her body had just been waiting for permission. Like all she needed was for one person to finally say, I will watch, so you do not have to. Jessie sat there in that chair by the door and just listened to them breathe. 3 children. His brother's children, sent to him through a blizzard and a dead man's letter after 6 months of running. He thought about Edgar Prescott. He thought about barns that burn in the night, about judges in a man's pocket, about the kind of monster who would beat a 3-year-old and then smile in church on Sunday. He thought about that letter tucked away in Eliza's boot, the one from Samuel, the one that was meant for him, the one that probably held answers to questions Jessie did not even know how to ask yet. He thought about his Rosie, about how she used to sleep just like Birdie was sleeping right then, one little fist curled around the blanket, her mouth open just a little, making that small sound of breathing that meant everything was all right in the world. Jessie pressed the palms of his hands to his eyes and held them there until the burning stopped. In the bed, Birdie shifted in her sleep. Her hand reached out and found Jessie's knee. Her small fingers curled around the rough fabric of his jeans, and they held on. Even asleep, she held on. Jessie did not move an inch, did not pull away. He just sat there in the dark with a dead man's daughter holding on to his knee and a word he had not let himself hear in 4 years echoing through the empty rooms of his heart. Papa. He was not her papa. He was not anyone's papa anymore. He had failed the one child God ever gave him and had spent 4 years turning himself to stone so he would never have to fail like that again. But this little baby, she did not know any of that. She did not care. She was 3 years old and cold and sick, and she had reached out in the dark for the nearest solid thing and just held on. And Jessie, God help him, he let her. The storm howled all night long, but the house held. 3 little children slept the deepest, most peaceful sleep they had known in 6 months. And in the chair by the door, a man who had sworn he would never love anything or anyone again sat and watched them breathe. He felt the ice that had been frozen around his heart crack for the very first time since he buried his own daughter in the hard ground out behind the barn. He did not sleep, did not even try to. He just watched and waited and wondered what on earth Samuel had written in that letter that was worth sending 3 children through a blizzard to deliver. Morning would come soon enough. The letter would be read, and the truth would land like a blacksmith's hammer. But that was for the morning. This was now. And right now, 3 little girls were safe and warm and sleeping. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. A part of him Jessie Hollowell never knew was missing until it stumbled up to his gate, half dead, and called him Papa. The morning broke gray and cold. The storm had passed, but the sky hadn't cleared. It just hung there low and heavy, like it was thinking about whether to hit them again. Jesse hadn't budged from that chair all night. His back was talking to him. His neck felt tight as a fiddle string. His legs had gone to sleep sometime around 4 in the morning, but little Bertie's hand was still wrapped around his knee, and he just didn't have the heart to move it. Eliza woke up first, her eyes snapping open all at once. There was no slow drift from sleep to being awake for her. She saw Jesse in the chair. She saw his hand resting near Bertie's head. She saw that he was still there. Something changed in her face. It was not trust, not just yet, but it was the little patch of ground where trust might take root if you gave it enough sun and time. "You stayed," she said. "I told you I would." Eliza sat up and looked over at her sisters. Hannah was still deep asleep, curled up tight with that drawing pressed to her chest, holding on to it even in her dreams. Bertie's breathing was better now, deeper. The color in her face had come back from that awful gray to something a whole lot closer to pink. Her fever broke about 3, Jessie told her. Lola came in and checked on her twice during the night. Eliza nodded, then swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up. She was still in the dry clothes Lola had found for her last night. They were way too big. The sleeves hung down past her hands. She looked just like a little kid playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. "Mr. Hollowell." "Yeah, the letter. The one Papa gave me." She took a breath. "You did not take it from me while I was asleep." "No, ma'am. That is yours to give me when you are ready." Eliza looked him over for a long moment. Then she bent down, pulled off her worn-out boot, reached deep inside, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn thin from 6 months of being carried, 6 months of being hidden, 6 long months on the run. She held it out to him. "I am ready." Jesse took it. The paper felt soft, almost like cloth. His brother's handwriting was on the outside, just 2 simple words. "For Jesse." He unfolded it and started to read. "Jesse, if you are reading this, it means I am dead and my girls managed to find you. That means Eliza did exactly what I asked. She is a brave one, braver than you or I ever were. Take care of them for me, brother, all 3 of them. Bertie is small, but she is tough as nails. Hannah, well, she stopped talking after what Edgar did. Do not push her. She will talk again when she feels safe. Eliza carries the weight of the whole world. She will tell you she is fine. She is not. She has not been fine since her mama passed 2 years back. Do not let her fool you. Now, for the hard part. Edgar Prescott is not our uncle. He is a business partner in some mining syndicate out of British Columbia. I worked that mine back in 1879. I saw a man get killed. The foreman, a fella named Jacob Dunning. He covered the whole thing up. I tried to do the right thing and report it. They came after me. I ran. Changed my name and hid my family, but they found me anyway. Jesse Edgar found me. He cut the brake line on my wagon, made it look like some kind of accident. I know he did it because I saw the cuts myself before I ever took that road. I drove it anyway. I had to lead them away from my girls. There is proof, Jesse. Everything. Papers, photographs, names, dates. I hid it all in the old stone well at our homestead just outside Elhorn Creek. It is the 3rd stone down from the water line on the north side. Get it, Jesse. Use it. Burn Edgar Prescott to the ground and every man who works for him. And brother, I am sorry. I am sorry for leaving. For staying away so long. I am sorry I was too proud to come on home. You deserve better than my silence. The girls, they deserve better than my mistakes. Give them what I never could. A home, a family, someone who stays. Your brother, Samuel." Jesse read it once, then twice, and then a 3rd time. He carefully folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, right next to his chest, right next to the heartbeat that was pounding so hard it felt like a drum in his ears. Eliza was watching his every move. "You knew," he said, "about the mine, about Edgar. Pa told me parts of it. Not the whole story, just enough for me to know that Uncle Edgar was a dangerous man, and that if anything ever happened, I was supposed to run. You ran twice before. Cheyenne, Laramie. He caught us both times." Eliza's voice was steady as a rock. but her hands were shaking. This time, I waited. I waited till he left for Helena on some bank business. I took money from his desk, bought us train tickets to the next town over. Then we walked, in the middle of January, through a blizzard with a 3-year-old. I did not plan for the blizzard, Mr. Hollowell. I planned the running. The good Lord handled the weather. Jessie almost cracked a smile. Almost. How much does Hannah know? Hannah knows everything, she just cannot say it out loud. Eliza looked at her sleeping sister. She saw things at Uncle Edgar's house, things she draws on paper instead of talking about. She has pictures of all of it. Every time he hit us, every time he locked us in the cellar, every time he... Eliza stopped, her jaw tight. She swallowed hard. Every time. Jessie's hands squeezed his knees into fists. What else did he do? Eliza just shook her head. Not now. Not in front of them. The words hung there in the air between them. Heavy. Ugly. Full of things a 9-year-old girl should never have to carry. Lola appeared in the doorway holding a tray with coffee, oatmeal, and fresh biscuits. She set it down, looked at Eliza, then looked at Jessie. The little one needs to eat small amounts, some warm broth if we have any. We have it, Jessie said. He stood up, his knees popping, his body reminding him he was 39 years old and had been parked in that hard wooden chair for 8 hours straight. He walked into the kitchen. Lola followed right behind him. You read the letter, she said. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. I read it. Jessie poured a cup of coffee and drank it black, burning his tongue. He did not even care. Samuel was murdered. Edgar Prescott killed him. There is proof of it all hidden in a well at the old homestead. Lola made the sign of the cross on her chest. And the children? They will stay here. Mr. Hollowell. Lola's voice was careful now. You know how folks in this town will talk. A man all alone with 3 little girls, no wife, no female kin to speak of. In a town like this, the talk will start before the snow even melts. Let it start. It is not the talk that I am worried about. It is what a man like Edgar does with that talk. A man like that will use it against you. He will say you are unfit. He will say the children are not safe. He will bring the law into it. Then I will deal with the law. Lola gave him a hard look, the same look she used to give him when he was drinking too much after Rosie passed. You cannot deal with the law by just being stubborn, Mr. Hollowell. You handle it by being smart. You get a lawyer, you get that proof out of that well. You get people on your side before Edgar even gets here because he will come. That little girl was right about that. He will come and he will smile that snake smile and half this town will believe every word that comes out of his mouth. Jessie set his cup down on the counter. You are right. I know I am right. I have been right about most things for 20 years. You just do not always listen. Jessie looked at her. This woman had raised him just as much as his own mother had. She had stood beside him as they buried his wife. She had been the one to wash Rosie's body for the funeral when Jessie's hands were shaking too bad to do it himself. Thank you, Lola, for last night, for everything. Lola just waved her hand at him. Do not you thank me. You feed those children. That is all the thanks I need. The rest of the day crawled by, all strange and quiet. Bertie's fever held steady at 101. It was not good, but she was not dying either. She mostly slept, waking up just to eat the broth that Lola spooned between her lips with the kind of patience only a woman who has fed sick children before can have. Hannah sat by the fire the whole morning, not making a sound, just drawing. She had pulled a stick of charcoal out of her coat pocket and found the back of an old feed bill on Jessie's desk. She drew without stopping, without even looking up, like the pictures were just spilling right out of her and she had to catch them on the paper. Jessie watched her from across the room. He could not see what she was drawing, and he was not sure he wanted to. Eliza worked without being asked, without being told what to do. She swept the kitchen floor, stacked firewood by the hearth, and helped Lola knead bread dough. She moved like a woman who had been keeping a house her whole life. She works like a grown woman, Lola whispered to Jessie as they watched her from the hallway. Who taught her all that? She taught herself, Jessie said. She had to. Around noon, Jessie put his coat on. "Where are you going?" Eliza asked. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, her hands covered in flour, her eyes sharp. "I am going to town. I need to see someone." "Who?" "Father O'Brien down at the church. And I need to send a message to a lawyer over in Cheyenne." A shadow passed over Eliza's face. "You are going to fight Edgar. I am going to do what your father asked me to do. I am going to protect you." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Hollowell, the last time someone tried to help us—" She did not finish. "I know. The Hendersons, their barn burned down." Jesse pulled on his gloves. "I am not the Hendersons, Eliza. I have been ranching this land for 20 years. I know every man in this territory, and I do not scare easy." Eliza looked at him, her face a mix of wanting to believe and being afraid to. "Come back," she said, "please. I will be back before dark. I promise." He rode toward Elhorn Creek under a sky that could not make up its mind if it wanted to snow or shine. The town was small. Just one main street with a general store, a saloon, the bank, the church, and the courthouse. It held maybe 300 souls on a good year. Father Patrick O'Brien was in the rectory, 62, years old, with white hair and gentle eyes. He was the sort of preacher who spent more time listening than talking. Jesse laid it all out for him. He spoke of the girls, the note from his brother, and the marks on their skin. He said the name Edgar. Father O'Brien remained silent for a long while. When Jesse was done, the priest folded his hands, his gaze fixed on the cross hanging over the door. "Do you take the child's word for it?" He said, "I believe the marks on a 3-year-old's arms. I believe the stripes from a belt on a 9-year-old's back. I believe a body does not get cigar burns by mistake. The other business, the killing and the mine, well, that is why there is evidence hidden in the well. But I have to ask you something first, Father. Does Edgar Prescott have ties to anybody important around here? Anyone with influence?" O'Brien's expression shifted, turning cautious. "Jesse, that man holds the debt on the bank, the general store, and the livery stable. He has been a benefactor to this church for 10 years. He and Marshal Dunning are as thick as thieves, just as close as can be. And then there is Judge Whitaker up in Cheyenne, the man who oversees all the custody hearings." O'Brien stopped for a moment. "I have caught wind of some things, nothing I could ever prove in court. But the talk is that Whitaker and Edgar have a deal." "What sort of deal?" "The kind where a judge's rulings favor the banker. And in return, the banker makes the judge's troubles with gambling just fade away." A chill washed over Jesse once more. The very same cold from the night before. This was not from the wind. It was something much meaner. So if Edgar makes a move for the girls and I stand against him, the judge has already been paid off. That is the long and short of it. O'Brien leaned in close. "Jesse, I am in your corner. The good Lord knows those little ones need someone to shield them. But you have got to see what you're up against. Edgar Prescott is more than just one person. He is an entire machine. He controls the law. He has all the money. He knows all the right people. You have your ranch and a decent soul. And from what I have seen, a decent soul comes out on the losing end against a rigged game 9 times out of 10. Then I reckon I will be the 10th time." O'Brien looked him over. Then a sorrowful smile touched his lips. "Your brother was just like that, stubborn clean through. You knew Samuel. He visited me one time, many years back, not long before he passed. He sat in that very chair, told me he had committed a sin he could never take back, and wanted to know if the Almighty could find it in his heart to love him. What was your answer?" I told him God's love was never in question. The real question was if he could love himself enough to reach out for help. Did he ask for it? No. O'Brien's voice dropped to a whisper. He walked out that door, and 6 months after that, he was gone. Do not follow his path, Jesse. Do not try to face this by yourself. Jesse rode back toward the ranch while the sun began to set. The orange glow fell on the white snow. It was a beautiful sight. He never saw it. He got back to find Eliza waiting on the porch. She shot to her feet the moment she spotted him. her small frame rigid until she was sure it was him and not a stranger. "You came home," she said. "I told you I would." The house was warm inside. Bertie was not sleeping, but sitting on Lola's lap near the fireplace. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes had more light in them. She was still unwell, but you could see the fight in her. As Jessie stepped through the door, Bertie saw him and held out her little arms. "Papa, up!" Jessie glanced at Lola. Lola gave a small shrug. The girl knows her own mind. So Jessie lifted Bertie into his arms. She felt as light as a feather. She rested her head against his shoulder, her tiny hand grabbing a piece of his shirt collar, and she let out a long sigh. It was the sound a child makes when they have finally gotten a hold of what they need most, with no plans of ever letting go. A lump formed in Jessie's throat. He just held her, unable to find any words. Eliza stood in the doorway watching them, her expression a complete mystery. Later that evening, with the girls asleep, Jessie was in his study. The letter sat on his desk next to a glass of whiskey he had not bothered to drink, while the fire faded to embers. He heard a gentle tap on the door. Jessie raised his head. Hannah was standing there. It was the first time she had ever approached him alone. The first time she had been anywhere without Eliza right beside her. She had a piece of paper in her hand. She crossed the room to his desk, placed it right in front of him, and met his gaze with her big brown eyes. Then she turned around and walked away without making a sound. Jessie looked down at the picture. This drawing was not like the rest. There was no angry man holding a belt, no little girls hiding in a corner. This picture was of a house with snow piled on its roof and smoke curling from the chimney. Inside the window he could see 4 figures, 3 little ones and 1 grown-up. The tall person was holding the littlest one. And all of them were there together, protected and warm, where the winter could not touch them. Down at the very bottom, in wobbly letters a child would make, Hannah had printed 2 words: "Our house." Jessie just looked at it as the fire burned down to nothing, as his whiskey sat untouched. Finally, the tears he had been holding back started to fall, landing on the paper and blurring the charcoal drawing just a bit. He rubbed his eyes, folded the drawing with great care, and tucked it into his pocket beside the letter from his brother. He now had 2 pieces of paper. One was from a brother long gone, telling him to put up a fight. The other was from a quiet little girl telling him she wanted him to stay. He decided he would do both. The following morning, Jessie was up before the sun. He got dressed and found Lola in the kitchen. "I need you to look after the girls for me today. I have to ride out to the old homestead, to the well." Lola put her coffee cup down. "You are going to get the evidence. I am going to get whatever Samuel left for me. If Edgar shows up while you are gone, he will not be here today. It is not his way. A man like Edgar makes plans. He never acts in a hurry." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I was raised around men just like Edgar, Mr. Hollowell. They are all cut from the same cloth. They are patient. They gather everything they need. They wait until no one is paying attention, and then they make their move." She stopped for a breath. "You probably have a week, maybe 2. Make them count." Jessie gave a slow nod and went to the guest room. Eliza was up, dressed, and busy braiding Hannah's hair. "I am heading out for the day," Jessie said. "I should be home before dark." "To the homestead?" "Yes." Eliza's fingers paused in the middle of a braid. "Be safe. Papa told me he put traps near the well to keep folks away." "What sort of traps?" "The painful kind." Jessie crouched down to be at her level. "Is there anything else you can tell me?" Eliza considered it. Then the 3rd stone up from the water on the north-facing side. "Papa said it has to be pulled directly out. If you twist it, the box will drop into the well, and everything inside will be destroyed. Your father was a clever man. He was." Eliza's voice trembled, just a little, revealing the sorrow she worked so hard to hide. "He was the most intelligent person I have ever known, but it was not enough to keep him alive." Jessie rested a hand on her shoulder for 3 seconds before he stood up. "I will be home by nightfall. You say that a lot because I mean it every time." He left the house, mounted his horse, and started the ride toward the old Colulton homestead for hours to the west. The clouds were finally breaking, showing the first patch of blue sky in a long while. It was so cold your breath would turn to ice, but at least the wind had died down. As he rode, his mind turned to Edgar Prescott, to corrupt judges and lawmen on the payroll. He thought about a world designed to look after the rich and grind everybody else into the dirt. He thought about his brother, Samuel, the little kid who used to trail behind him everywhere. He pictured the man who purposely steered a damaged wagon off a mountain pass because he understood it was the one thing he could do to draw trouble away from his kids. His thoughts turned to Rosie, and the way he had let her down when the sickness came, and he was powerless against it. And all his power, all his property, and all his wealth counted for nothing when his own daughter was gone, and there was no way to bring her back. He thought about little Birdie, the sound of her voice saying "Papa," and the feeling of her small hand clutching his shirt like he was her only anchor. He thought of Hannah, a 6-year-old girl who had learned that speaking was a risk, so she used drawings to show the truth without fear of being struck. He thought of Eliza, 9 years old, bearing the weight of the world, keeping a knife under her pillow and defending her sisters with a fire that would make a grown man back down. 3 little girls, his brother's daughters, sent to him in the middle of a snowstorm carrying a note from a dead man, 6 months' worth of awful marks, and one last fading hope that he could live up to the man his brother thought he was. Jesse tightened his grip on the reins, clenched his teeth, and spurred his horse on. He was determined to find that evidence. He was going to bring Edgar Prescott's world down in flames. And he was going to provide those girls with the one thing they had never known: a real home. The kind of home where no one ever raised a hand to you, or hurt you with fire, or shut you away in a dark room. The kind of place where you did not need a knife to feel safe, where you could draw what you wanted without being afraid, and where you could call a man Papa knowing he would give his own life before he let anyone harm you ever again. The old homestead finally came into view. There were charred beams and blackened ground, but right in the center of all that destruction, the stone well stood there as if nothing had happened. Jesse got off his horse and approached it. It was his brother's final resting place and his brother's last offering, waiting together for him. He began his descent. The rope seared his hands as he lowered himself into the dark. 20 feet of blackness, and the air grew colder the farther he went down. When his boots finally touched the water, his whole body was shaking, and he could no longer feel his fingers. The water was up to his knees. It was ice cold, a deep, biting cold that felt like it was trying to crush his very bones. He lit a match. Light bloomed against. The walls of the well were round and made of stone. The water below was as black as a starless night. Jesse could see his own breath puff out in front of him like little white clouds. He looked for the 3rd stone up from the waterline on the north side. The instructions were clear. Do not twist it. Jesse noticed right away this stone looked newer than the rest. The mortar holding it was a sight fresher. He took out his knife and worked the blade into the seam. He had to be careful, steady, like when you are pulling a calf that is coming out wrong. He used just enough force to get it moving, but not so much that it would break anything. The stone popped free. Tucked behind it was a metal box sealed up tight with wax to keep the water out. It felt heavy for something so small. Jesse grabbed it, slid it inside his coat, and started to climb. About halfway up, his boot slipped on the slick stone. The rope snapped tight, yanking his shoulder something fierce, and he slammed into the wall. The rough stone dug into his ribs, but he held on. He kept climbing and did not dare stop until the blue sky filled his vision and the cold air rushed into his lungs, feeling warm after the damp chill of the well. He sat on the frozen dirt, catching his breath. He held the box, his brother's last secret, in his lap. He cracked the wax seal and lifted the lid. Inside, all wrapped in oilcloth, he found papers, photographs, and a leather journal. Tucked between its pages were dried wildflowers, purple and yellow ones, the kind that grew up in the high meadows come summertime. The very kind Catherine used to love to pick before she passed on. Jesse's hands started to tremble. He opened the journal first. It was Samuel's handwriting, page after page filled with dates, names, and hard details. He had recorded every single death at the Whitefish mine with the care of a man who knew he was building a case that could very well get him killed. 12 men had died between 1877 and 1883. Every last one was called an accident, and every last report was signed by the mine foreman, a man named Jacob Dunning. Jesse forgot to breathe for a second and read that name again. Jacob Dunning. He was Marshal Wade Dunning's brother. Wade Dunning was the marshal of Elorn Creek, the man with the badge who was supposed to keep the peace, the man sworn to protect good people like Eliza and Hannah and Birdie. His own brother was the one who had covered up 12 killings. Jesse read on. The mine belonged to a company with a false front called Western Range Holdings. Samuel had dug through the territory records to find out who really owned it. 3 names were listed: Jacob Dunning, Edgar Prescott, and Judge Arthur Whitaker. The same judge who oversaw custody hearings, the same judge that O'Brien had said was in Edgar's pocket. He was not just in his pocket, he was his partner. He was a co-owner, and he was the man who would decide if Jesse got to keep the girls. And that very man had helped murder their father. Jesse shut the journal. He put everything back into the box and sealed it up again. He rode back as hard as he could. The 4-hour ride felt like 40. With every mile that passed, the thing he carried felt heavier. It was not the box. It was the knowledge, the awful understanding of what he was truly up against. It was not just one man. It was a whole system, a machine built out of money and the law and the kind of evil that puts on a friendly face and sits next to you in church on Sunday. He made it back to the ranch just as the sun was setting. Lola was standing on the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, a worried look on her face. "Something happened," she said, even before he had swung down from his horse. "What is it?" Marshal Dunning paid a visit about 2 hours ago. He had papers. A cold dread settled in Jesse's stomach. What kind of papers? A welfare check. It was the same old song. Edgar Prescott had filed a complaint. He claims that 3 minor children are missing from his legal care, and he has good reason to think they are here. Lola's voice was strong, but her eyes gave away her fear. The marshal spoke with Eliza. Jesse was off his horse before Lola could say another word. "Where is she?" "She is in the kitchen. She is all right." She handled him. Lola took a breath. "She did better than I would have. Better than most grown women I know." Jesse went inside. He found Eliza sitting at the kitchen table with Hannah drawing right beside her. Birdie was propped up in a chair, wrapped in blankets, wide awake and eating little pieces of bread Lola had torn for her. Eliza looked up as Jesse came in. Her face was pale, but her eyes were like steel. "The marshal asked me some questions," she told him. I told him what he needed to hear. "And what was that?" "I told him we are here because this is where we want to be. I told him that Uncle Edgar gets angry sometimes, and I told him we do not want to go back there." She stopped for a moment. He wrote it all down in his little book. Then he said, "Uncle Edgar has filed for a formal custody hearing. Judge Whitaker is coming down from Cheyenne in 6 weeks to make a decision. 6 weeks. That would be February 28th. Eliza's voice did not shake one bit. The marshal said, "You need to establish legal standing by then, or the judge will have no choice but to give us back to Edgar." Jesse sat down in the chair across from her. He placed the metal box on the table. Eliza just stared at it. "You found it." "I found it. And Eliza, it is even worse than what your father wrote. The mine, the deaths. Edgar is not just some guardian who hit you. He is a part of something much bigger. The marshal's brother was the one running the mine. The judge who is going to decide your future is Edgar's business partner. They are all in it together." Eliza did not even flinch. She did not cry. She just nodded her head, like she was hearing news she had been expecting her whole life. "Papa said it went high up. He said the law was bought and paid for. That is why he ran instead of trying to report it." She looked down at the box. "Is there enough in there to stop them? Enough to prove what happened at the mine?" There is enough to prove Edgar killed your father. But none of that will matter if the judge who hears the case is the same man who is getting rich from the mine. So what do? We find a way around the judge. We go right over his head. We take this to people who cannot be bought. Who? Jesse thought of Father O'Brien, and he thought about the church records. He thought about the one place in this whole territory that Edgar could not possibly own. I need to think on it. But first, I have to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the honest-to-God truth. All of it. Eliza looked him straight in the eye. Ask. Your father's letter mentioned that Hannah stopped talking because of something Edgar did. What exactly did he do? Eliza's jaw tightened. She glanced over at Hannah. The 6-year-old was busy with her drawing, lost in her own little world. Maybe she was not listening, or maybe she was hearing every word, but just could not say anything back. He locked her in the root cellar, Eliza said quietly, for 3 days. No food, no light. She was screaming the whole first day and just crying on the second. By the 3rd day, she had gone quiet. She has not said a word since then. Jesse felt that old rage bubble up inside him. It was a familiar heat, like a volcano, a legacy from his own father. It was the anger that ran in his blood, just waiting for moments like this to remind him of what he was made of. He shut his eyes and took 1 deep breath, then 2, then 3. When he opened them again, Eliza was watching him. She was studying him the way she studied everything, looking for any sign of danger. "You are angry," she said. "Yes. Are you going to hit something?" "No, Papa used to get angry like that, too. His face would change, but he never laid a hand on us, not one time." She paused. "Is that what your father did? Did he hit people when he got angry?" Jesse looked at this 9-year-old girl who saw right through everything and understood more than most grown folks. "Yes, that is exactly what he did. And you are afraid you will become him, every single day of my life." Eliza nodded, as if that answer made sense to her, like it was the right and honest thing to say. "Papa said the same thing. He said, 'Your father was a cruel man, and both of you spent your whole lives trying not to be him.'" She reached her small hand across the table and laid it on the box. "Papa won. He never hit anyone. He never turned into your father." She looked right at Jesse. "You can win too." Jesse just stared at the child. This impossibly brave, impossibly smart, impossibly hurt child who had walked through a blizzard with her 2 sisters and a letter from a dead man, and still had enough strength left inside her to comfort a grown man about his own demons. "How old are you?" he asked her. 9. "You talk like you are 90. That is what happens when you grow up fast, Mr. Hollowell. You skip all the middle parts." The next 2 weeks went by in a blur. Jesse sent a message to a lawyer in Cheyenne, a young fellow named David Hart, fresh out of law. Young lawyer, fresh out of law school, eager for a case that was about something. Hart showed up on a Tuesday, read the papers from the well, and just about fell clean out of his chair. "Good heavens," Hart said. "This is enough to take down the whole mine, the judge, and the marshal, too. This is pure dynamite. But can you use that in a custody fight?" Hart shook his head. "Not straight on. A hearing about the children is supposed to be about their well-being, not about who's a criminal. But if we can show that Judge has a dog in this fight, get him kicked off the case, and get an honest judge in his place, then yes, Edgar will lose it all. So how do we get rid of the judge? We need somebody with some real authority to stand up to him. A federal marshal. Maybe somebody from the territorial governor's office. A person Edgar can't just brush aside." Jesse thought on it, running through the names of folks he knew, who might owe him a favor, who had the grit to take on a rotten system. "Clara Whitfield," he finally said. Hart gave him a puzzled look. "Who's that?" "Clara June Whitfield. She's the town nurse, the midwife, and a widow. She brought half the children in this territory into the world. She doctored the miners' wives for years. She knows exactly what went on at that mine because she saw what came after, the widows and the orphans it left behind. A nurse isn't quite a federal lawman, Jesse. No, but Clara Whitfield's husband, rest his soul, was Territorial Senator Thomas Whitfield. She still has friends in high places at the governor's office, and she owes me one. Hart's eyebrows shot up. Must be a mighty big favor. I pulled her son out from under a cattle stampede back in '83, saved his life. She told me if I ever needed anything at all, she'd move heaven and hell to make it happen. I reckon we're gonna need both, Hart said. Jessie rode out to Clara's place the next morning. She lived right on the edge of town in a small house with a tidy garden that was thriving, even in the dead of winter. She was the kind of woman who could make things grow whether the dirt wanted to or not. She opened the door before he could even knock. 42 years old, with dark hair showing streaks of gray, and eyes that saw everything and forgot nothing. Jessie Hollowell, I've been wondering when you were going to show up on my doorstep. The whole town is buzzing about you and those little girls. Can I come on in? You had better. I have hot coffee and a lot of questions, and I'm not sure which one of them is stronger. They sat down at her kitchen table, and Jessie told her the whole story. She just listened, never saying a word. When he was done, she sat there in the quiet for a good long while. Then she got up, went to a cabinet, and pulled out a wooden box. She set it right on the table. I have been holding on to these for 8 years now, she said. She opened the lid. Inside were letters, stacks of them, written by miners, their wives, and their widows. Penned by women who had lost their husbands at the White Fish Mine and were given just a handful of coins to stay silent. Every single woman who came to me after her husband was killed in that mine, Clara said. I asked her to write it all down. What happened, what the company told them, how much they were paid, and how they were threatened to keep their mouths shut. She took a breath. 12 women, 12 dead husbands, and 12 stories that nobody in this town wanted to hear. Jessie just stared at the pile of letters. Why did you keep all these? Because someone had to, she said. Because those women deserved to have a witness, even if no one was listening. She looked Jessie square in the eye. And because I knew, sooner or later, someone would come along who was just stubborn enough to pick this fight. She sat back in her chair. Now, what is it you need from me? I need you to get in touch with the governor's office. I need you to get Judge Whitaker thrown off this custody case and have a fair judge put in his place. Clara nodded. I can do that. Thomas had some good friends in the governor's mansion. Good, honest men. But Jessie, she said, leaning in closer, it is going to take some time. And Edgar is not going to sit back and wait. The second he gets wind that someone is messing with his judge, he is going to move, and he is going to move fast. He will come for those girls. Let him come. Clara shook her head. That is not going to be enough. You need this whole town on your side, not just me and Father O'Brien. You need folks who will stand up in that courtroom and say those children belong right here with you. You need people to testify about the abuse. You need the doctor to talk about those bruises. We do not have a doctor. We have you. Then I will be the one to testify. Clara's voice turned to steel. I will testify about every last bruise on those children's bodies, about the cigar burns I saw on Eliza's arm, about how they were nearly starved, and about why little Hannah will not speak. She paused. And I will tell them what I saw when Edgar brought Bertie to me last September. He brought her in with a broken wrist and told me she fell off a porch. Jessie froze. A broken wrist. She was 2 years old, Jessie. 2-year-olds do not break their wrists like that from falling off a porch. Not the way that little bone was broken. It was twisted, snapped. The kind of break you see when a grown man grabs a child's arm and yanks with all his might. You knew. You knew, and you did not say anything to the law. For just a second, Clara's strong face crumpled, and you could see the guilt she had been carrying. I told the marshal. I filed a report. Dunning buried it deep. He told me I was making a mountain out of a molehill. Said that Edgar was a respected man in this town, and I should learn to mind my own business. She wiped at her eyes. I have lived with that choice every single day since then, wondering if I should have done more, wondering if those children were hurting because I was not brave enough to push back harder. You are pushing now. Yes, I am, she said, and I'm not going to stop until I know those girls are safe. Jesse rode back to the ranch with a feeling he had not had in a long, long time. It was not hope, not exactly. It was something tougher than that. It was determination. The kind you get when you know you are outgunned and outnumbered, but you choose to make a stand anyway. He found Eliza back in the stable. She was grooming the mare, the very same horse Jesse had ridden through that blizzard the night he brought them home. Eliza had taken a real shine to that animal. She spent an hour with her every single day. You sure like horses, Jesse said. Papa had a horse, a bay mare he called Penny. Edgar sold her right after Papa died. Eliza's voice was empty. I stood there and watched him lead her away. Birdie cried for 3 whole days. Jesse leaned up against the stall door. I spoke with someone today, a woman by the name of Clara Whitfield. She is going to help us. How? She knows some people in the governor's office. She's going to try to get that judge taken off our case, so we can get a fair hearing. Eliza stopped brushing the horse and looked over at Jesse. And if she cannot? If we are stuck with that judge, then we fight him anyway with everything we have got. Eliza was quiet for a second. Mr. Hollowell, there is something else. Something I have not told you. Jesse waited. Papa did not just hide those papers down in that well. He hid something else, too, something he told me about the night before he died. What was it? Eliza put the brush down. Her little hands were shaking. Papa said that when he was working at the mine, there was another man who saw the killing. Another witness. A man who ran away just like Papa did. He changed his name, and he just disappeared. She paused. Papa said if we ever got into real trouble, if the papers were not enough, this man could testify. He could stand up in a courtroom and tell everyone what he saw with his own 2 eyes. Who is he? Eliza looked right at Jesse. His name was Daniel. Daniel Harrove. But that is not his real name. Eliza swallowed hard. Papa said his real name was Nathan Hollowell. Jesse did not move a muscle. He did not even breathe. The whole stable went dead silent. Even the horses stopped their shuffling. Nathan Hollowell. That was his father's name and his grandfather's before him. A family name passed down from one generation to the next like an old scar. I do not know anybody named Nathan Hollowell, Jesse said, but his voice sounded like it was coming from a long way off. Papa said you would say that. He said you would not know him because he has been in hiding for 9 years, living under a different name up in British Columbia, but Papa said Nathan was family. Eliza paused again. Papa said Nathan was your cousin, your uncle's son, the one everybody thought had died in the war. Jesse gripped the stall door so tight his knuckles went white. Matthew's boy, Uncle Matthew's son, Nathan, the cousin Jesse had grown up with side by side, the cousin who had gone off to fight in 1863 and had never come home. The whole family had mourned him. They put up a stone for him and said their prayers, and all this time he was alive, hiding, running from the very same men who had killed Samuel. Where in British Columbia? A town called Whitefish, right up near the border. Papa wrote him a letter, told him everything that happened, said that if anything ever happened to him, Nathan should come find you. Eliza's voice got quiet. Papa said Nathan has been waiting all this time for someone to fight back. He just needed to know it was safe to come out of hiding. Jesse closed his eyes and felt the whole crushing weight of it settle on him. His brother murdered, his cousin alive, a mine full of dead men, a judge in a banker's pocket, a banker who beat on little children, and 3 little girls standing right in the middle of it all. He opened his eyes and looked at Eliza. Is there anything else? Anything at all that your father told you? Eliza met his stare. Just one more thing. Tell me. Papa said Edgar did not just kill him over those mine documents. He said Edgar killed him because Papa had found out something else. Something about where Edgar got his money. The bank. She took a breath. Papa said Edgar has been stealing from the estates of orphans for years and years. Every child in this territory who lost their parents, Edgar took what was left to them. He used it to fund that mine. He used it to pay off the judge. He used it to build everything he has. Jesse felt a wave of sickness wash over him. A man who would steal from orphans, who would hurt children, who would kill their father and then try to take them too. The law protected him because the law was a part of his dirty dealings. How much? Papa said thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars stolen from families who had nothing left to their name. Eliza's chin started to tremble. Papa said some of those families starved. Their children were sent off to workhouses because the money their parents had left for them was just gone. And all the while, Edgar sat in his bank with a smile on his face. Jesse pulled Eliza into a hug. She did not pull away. For the very first time since she had shown up, she let someone hold her. She let herself be small. She let all that armor she wore fall away just long enough to feel the grief she had been carrying for 6 long months. She did not cry, not yet. That would come later. For now, she just stood there with her face pressed against Jesse's chest, shaking. "I am tired, Mr. Hollowell. I know you are. I am so tired of being brave. Then just stop for a minute. I have got you." She trembled like that for a little while. Then the shaking stopped. She pulled back and wiped her face on her sleeve. She looked up at him with those old eyes in that young face. "You are going to write to Nathan," she said, "tonight. And you are going to get Clara to remove the judge, already working on it. And you are going to take those documents and burn Edgar Prescott's life down to the ground. Every last bit of it." Eliza nodded. "Good." She picked up the brush and went back to the horse. Her hands were steady now. Her back was straight. "Mr. Hollowell." "Yeah." Eliza did not turn around. She just kept brushing the horse's coat, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. "Papa was right about you. You are a good man." Jesse stood there in the doorway of the stable. The evening light was starting to fade. From inside the house, he could hear Lola singing something soft in Spanish. He could hear Birdie laughing. It was the first time he had ever heard that child laugh. It was a small, bright sound, a little startled, like she had surprised herself by remembering how to do it. And somewhere in that house, Hannah was drawing. She was drawing a world she could not speak about, a world that had hurt her in ways no child should ever be hurt. But she was also drawing a house with smoke coming from the chimney, and 4 little figures in the window. At the bottom, she had written 2 words that meant more than any legal paper or court testimony or hidden proof ever could. Our house. Jesse turned away from the stable and walked toward the sound of laughter, toward the warmth, toward the fight that was surely coming, and toward the family that was already here. He had 6 weeks. He had a box full of a dead man's evidence, a nurse who knew people, a priest with a spine of steel, a lawyer who was hungry for a fight, and 3 little girls who had walked through a blizzard because their father believed Jesse Hollowell was worth walking to. He was going to prove Samuel right. 3 weeks passed, 3 weeks of just waiting. For 3 weeks they built what felt like a real life, all the while knowing it could be ripped to shreds in a courtroom on February 28th. Little Birdie, she got better. Her fever finally broke on the 5th day. By day 10, she was up and walking. By day 15, she was tearing through that house with an energy that wore out everybody but Lola. Lola had raised enough kids to know a toddler getting over pneumonia was either going to be asleep or raising heck. Birdie followed Jesse everywhere. Out to the barn, across the yard, even into his study. She would sit right there on his lap while he worked the books, grabbing at his pen and leaving little ink smudges on the ledger that Eliza would fuss at her for later. And every single time she called him Papa. Jesse had given up on correcting her. He had stopped flinching when he heard it. He had even started answering to it without a second thought. the same way you answer to your own name, because it is yours, whether you picked it out or not. Hannah still was not talking, but she drew pictures every day, stacks of them. Lola gathered them all up and kept them in a box in the kitchen. Some of them were dark, showing the man with the belt, or the cellar with no light. They showed a small girl alone in the dark, with her hands clamped over her ears. But little by little, the pictures started to change. There were horses, the kitchen, Lola kneading bread, Birdie laughing. And always, always, there was the house, with 4 figures standing in the window. Eliza took to that ranch like she had been born and raised on it. She could rope a fence post from 20 feet out, could saddle a horse all by herself, and could read the sky for weather better than some folks can read a book. She was fierce and she was capable, and she was still sleeping with a knife under her pillow every single night. Jesse did not take it from her. He understood why she needed it. He knew that feeling safe was not something you believed in just because someone told you to. It was something you had to earn back, one night at a time. The letter to Nathan Hollowell went out during the 2nd week. Father O'Brien sent it by telegram all the way to Whitefish, British Columbia. It was short and careful, the kind of message that said everything by saying almost nothing at all. Family in Wyoming needs your help. Samuel sent us. Come if you can. Jesse? No answer came back. Not the 1st week and not the 2nd. Jesse told himself it did not matter one bit. He told himself the case was plenty strong without some witness from Canada. He told himself he was not disappointed. He was lying through his teeth. Clara Whitfield, she worked fast. She sent 2 letters to the governor's office and made a personal visit to the territorial capital. She came back on a Thursday, dusty and tired, but smiling for the first time since Jesse had met her. Judge Whitaker has been removed from the case, she said. They were all sitting in Jesse's kitchen. Lola was pouring coffee. Eliza stood in the doorway just listening. Jesse had learned that about her. She listened to everything. She missed nothing. The governor's office looked into the conflict of interest. Turns out Whitaker owns a piece of the same mine that is connected to Edgar Prescott. They cannot let him rule on a custody case involving Edgar's wards. A new judge has been assigned. Clara took a breath. Margaret Harlow, out of Helena. A woman? Jesse asked, surprised. A woman. She is the first female judge in the territory, appointed 6 months ago. She has a reputation for being fair and for having an absolute hatred for corruption. Clara finally smiled. Edgar Prescott has no earthly idea what is about to hit him. Jesse felt something tight in his chest finally loosen, a knot he had been carrying for weeks. What about Edgar? Does he know yet? He will find out the moment he walks into that courtroom, and by then it will be far too late for him to buy his way out of this. Eliza spoke up from the doorway. He will just try something else. He always does. Clara looked over at the girl. You are right. He will. And that is exactly why we need to be ready for anything. That night, Jesse could not get to sleep. He just laid there, in bed, staring up at the ceiling. 3 days until the hearing. 3 days until some judge he had never laid eyes on would decide if 3 little girls he had known for 6 weeks would stay, or if they would be sent back to a man who burned them with cigars and locked them in cellars. There was a soft knock at his door. Come in. It was Eliza standing in the doorway in her nightgown, barefoot. She looked younger than she had since the night she first showed up. Cannot sleep either, she said. No, ma'am. She came in and sat on the edge of his bed. She drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Mr. Hollowell, if we lose, if that judge says we have to go back, we are not going to lose. But if we do, Eliza's voice was as steady as a rock, I need you to know that I will run again. I will take Hannah and Birdie, and I will run so far. I will not let him hurt them any more. I would rather die in a blizzard than go back to that house. Jessie sat up and looked at her. This child, who had been carrying the weight of 2 other lives on her shoulders for 6 long months. This little girl who had not slept a peaceful night since June, who was 9 years old and already making plans for what to do if every grown-up in her life failed her all over again. Listen to me, Eliza. I am not going to let that happen. But if somehow it does, if the whole world goes crooked and the law lets us down, then I will put you and your sisters on a horse myself, and we will all ride together. I am not sending you out into the cold all alone ever again. You hear me? Eliza just stared at him. Her chin started to tremble. You mean that? I mean every word of it. Even if it means breaking the law. Even if they come after you. Even then. She was quiet for a long, long time. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. She felt small and warm, and trusting in a way she had not been since that first night. Papa would have liked you, she whispered. I would have liked him too. I should have told him that when I had the chance. They sat there in the silence. The old house creaked around them. The wind pushed against the windows and the fire was dying down in the other room. You should get some sleep, Jessie said. So should you. I will sleep when this is all over. Eliza gave him a small, sad smile. You sound like me. She went back to her room. Jessie heard her door close, heard the bed spring shift, and then he heard nothing else. He hoped she was sleeping. He hoped that knife was still under her pillow, but that her hand was not resting on it. The morning of the hearing came on cold and bright. February 28th. It was the kind of day that hurt your lungs to breathe. But it was so clear you could see 50 miles in every direction. Jesse, dressed in his best clothes, a clean shirt, his good boots, and the coat Catherine had given him the Christmas before she died. He had not worn it in 4 years. It still smelled like cedar from the chest, where Lola had it stashed. The girls were all set. Lola had stitched up some new dresses for them. Eliza's was a nice blue. Hannah's was yellow. Birdie wore a white one with little flowers that Lola had embroidered herself, staying up late every single night for 2 weeks. They looked just like regular children, not like they were on the run or had nowhere to go. They looked like kids who were taken care of, who were loved, who were whole. Eliza found Jessie in the kitchen. Her hair was in braids, and she stood up tall and straight like a soldier heading off to war. You ready? Jessie asked. No, she said, but let's go on anyway. They all rode into town together. Jessie and Eliza were on horseback. Lola drove the wagon with Hannah and Birdie inside. The morning was quiet, with no wind blowing, and the only sound was the horses' hooves on the frozen dirt. The courthouse was already packed when they got there. 60 people were crammed into a room made for 30. It was standing room only. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out to watch. Jessie recognized some faces. There was Miguel, his head ranch hand, standing in the back holding his hat. He saw Rosa Chen from the general store, the one who brought the fabric for the girls' dresses and wouldn't take a penny for it. He spotted Jenkins, the blacksmith, who had fixed his gate latch just last week and told him, man to man, that he was doing the right thing. And then, on the other side of the room, sat Edgar Prescott at the petitioner's table, all by himself, dressed sharp, clean-shaven, with the face of a man who'd never done a lick of wrong in his life. He looked right at Jessie when they walked in and gave a little smile. It was the same smile he used when he was approving your loan, and the same one he used when he was foreclosing on your house. Next to him, Marshal Wade Dunning sat in the front row, his badge shined up, his face giving away nothing. He was the law, bought and paid for. Jessie took his seat, his heart pounding beside him. Eliza sat behind him with Lola and the girls. He could feel Eliza's eyes on the back of his neck. He could feel her being scared. He could feel her trying her best to be brave. All rise. They all stood up. The door behind the judge's bench opened and Judge Margaret Harlow walked in. She was 55 years old with gray hair pulled back tight. Her face was like a stone wall. You couldn't read a thing on it. She sat down, gave the whole courtroom a good look, taking it all in with one sweep of her eyes. Edgar's smile flickered. Jessie caught it. It was just for a second, a moment of pure confusion. Edgar had been expecting Whitaker. He had planned on Whitaker. He had paid for Whitaker. He sure hadn't planned on her. "Y'all be seated," Judge Harlow said, her voice filling the room without any effort. "We are here today to discuss the custody and guardianship of 3 minor children: Eliza May Colton, Hannah Grace Colton, and Birdie Colton." She looked over at Edgar. "Mr. Prescott, you are the petitioner. You can start when you're ready." Edgar stood up, smooth as you please, that smile right back where it belonged. "Your Honor, I am the legal guardian of these 3 children appointed to me in their late father's will. They have been missing from my home for 6 weeks. I have good reason to believe they are being held unlawfully by Mr. Jesse Hollowell." "Held," Judge Harlow repeated the word, her voice flat. "Are you suggesting he is keeping them there against their will?" "I am suggesting, Your Honor, that a single man with no wife, no female family members, and no legal right has taken 3 young girls into his home without any authority or supervision." Edgar's voice was smooth and practiced, sounding perfectly reasonable. "Whatever his reasons, the situation is not proper." Hart stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Hollowell is not holding these children. They came to him during a blizzard, half dead, running from the abuse they suffered at the hands of Mr. Prescott." "Objection!" Edgar's voice cut sharp. "That is a mighty serious accusation with no proof." Judge Harlow looked at Hart. "Do you have any proof, Counselor?" "We certainly do, Your Honor." Hart opened his satchel. "We have a medical report, statements from witnesses, and papers documenting the injuries all 3 children received while they were in Mr. Prescott's care." Hart called Clara Whitfield to the stand first. Clara walked up, sat down, and looked Edgar straight in the eye. "Mrs. Whitfield, you examined the children." "I did, 3 times since they showed up at Mr. Hollowell's ranch." Clara's voice was clear and professional, the voice of a woman who had delivered babies, set broken bones, and told mothers their children wouldn't make it through the night. "Eliza Colton has bruises on her back and upper arms that match being hit with a belt. She has 3 round burn scars on her left forearm. They are from a cigar, and they were put there on purpose. Hannah Colton has similar belt marks, but they are older and layered, which shows she was abused repeatedly for months. And Birdie Colton—" Clara took a breath. "Birdie Colton shows signs of a left wrist that was broken before and healed wrong. It's the kind of break you see when an adult grabs and twists a child's wrist." A low murmur went through the courtroom. Judge Harlow's gavel came down once. "Did you examine Birdie's wrist before, Mrs. Whitfield?" "Last September. Mr. Prescott brought her to me. He said she fell off the porch. I filed a report about it with the marshal's office." Clara looked over at Dunning. "That report was never followed up on." Dunning's face turned beet red. He fidgeted in his seat but didn't say a word. Edgar stood up. "Your Honor, children fall down. They get bruises. Mrs. Whitfield is not a doctor. She's just a midwife with a wild imagination." Judge Harlow just looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Prescott. You will get your turn." Next, Hart called Eliza. The little girl walked to the stand, looking so small in that big witness chair her feet didn't even touch the floor. But she sat up straight, and her eyes were clear. Hart spoke gently. "Eliza, can you tell the court what it was like living with Mr. Prescott?" Eliza looked at Edgar. He smiled at her. But it was the kind of smile that was also a threat. She looked away from him and over to Jesse. Jesse gave her a slow nod. "Uncle Edgar hit us," Eliza said, and her voice didn't even tremble. "Mostly with his belt, but sometimes with his hand. He burned me with his cigar 3 times. He locked Hannah in the root cellar for 3 days just because she spilled some milk on his desk. When she finally came out, she wasn't talking anymore. She hasn't said a word since then." The courtroom was completely still. Judge Harlow was writing, her face impossible to read. Eliza kept going. "Some days he wouldn't feed us. He said we had to earn our food. Birdie was always hungry. She cried a lot, and that just made him angrier. One night he grabbed her arm and twisted it. I heard the bone snap. She paused for a moment. That was the night I knew we had to get away. Edgar shot up again. Your Honor, this child has been coached. She's clearly been coached by Mr. Hollowell to back up his illegal claim. Judge Harlow's eyes turned to ice. Mr. Prescott, if you interrupt this testimony one more time, I will hold you in contempt of court. Now, sit down. Edgar sat. That smile of his was long gone, but Eliza wasn't done yet. My daddy told me before he died that I had to find Mr. Hollowell. He said he was family. He said he was the only person in the whole world who could keep us safe. She reached into her pocket and pulled out Samuel's letter. Papa wrote this. It explains everything. It tells you who Edgar really is, what he did, and why we had to run away. Hart took the letter and handed it up to the judge. Judge Harlow read it slowly. As she read, her face changed from neutral to focused, and then to something much harder. She put the letter down and looked at Edgar. Mr. Prescott, this letter makes some very serious claims, including that you were directly part of the reason for the death of these children's father. Lies, Edgar snapped. Those are just the ramblings of a paranoid man who died in a wagon accident. Hart stood up. Your Honor, we have more evidence. He pulled out the journal they found in the well and other documents that Samuel Colton had hidden before he died. These papers detail the business of the Whitefish mine up in British Columbia. They mention 12 deaths that were called accidents, and they name Mr. Prescott, Marshal Wade Dunning's brother Jacob Dunning, and the former judge Arthur Whitaker as co-owners of that mine. The courtroom just erupted. People were shouting. Dunning jumped to his feet. Edgar's face went pale as a ghost. Judge Harlow's gavel came down hard. 3 times. Order! I will have order in here or I will clear this courtroom. Silence fell over the room, heavy and thick. Judge Harlow looked at the documents, taking her sweet time, reading every single page. The whole courtroom waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nobody even breathed. Finally, she looked up. Marshal Dunning approached the bench. Dunning walked forward, stiff as a board, his hand hovering near his gun. These papers say your brother was the foreman at a mine owned by Mr. Prescott. A mine where 12 men died under very suspicious circumstances. Is your brother's name Jacob Dunning? Dunning's jaw tightened. I decline to answer, Your Honor. This isn't a criminal trial, Marshal. I'm asking you a direct question. Is Jacob Dunning your brother? Yes, ma'am, he is. And did you bury a report that Mrs. Whitfield filed about injuries to the child, Bertie Colton? Dunning glanced at Edgar. Edgar just stared at the table. I may have misplaced the paperwork, Dunning mumbled. Judge Harlow stared him down. Take off your badge, Marshal. You are suspended until we can investigate this. She turned to the bailiff. Detain Mr. Dunning. He is not to leave this building. 2 men stepped forward. Dunning didn't put up a fight. He just stood there while they took his badge, his gun, and his authority. Everything that had made him think he was untouchable. Edgar stood up slowly, his composure finally shattering. Cracks were spreading across that respectable face of his like ice breaking up on a pond in the spring. Your Honor, I would like to address the court. You may. Edgar looked around the courtroom, at all the faces staring at him, at the town he had practically owned for a decade, at the very people who had trusted him with their money, their children, and their futures. Then his eyes landed on Eliza, on Hannah clutching her drawings, on Bertie sitting in Lola's lap, and finally on Jessie. I am not going to stand here and deny all of it, Edgar said. His voice was different now, much quieter. All the charm was gone. Underneath it all was something tired and ugly and real. I hit those children. I burned that girl. I locked the little one in the dark. I did every bit of it. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. I did it because I am a coward. Because Samuel Colton found out what I was and I could not let him expose me. Because after he died I had his children and they knew too much. And I did not know what to do with them except to make them afraid. Edgar's hands were shaking. I stole from orphan estates, 6 different families, $4,000. I used it to fund the mine, to pay off Whitaker, to keep the whole machine running. He looked right at Jesse. Your brother was a better man than I will ever be. He died because he had the courage to do what I never could, to tell the truth. Edgar turned back to the judge. I withdraw my petition for custody. I surrender myself to the authority of this court, and I ask that these children be placed in the care of Jesse Hollowell. Not because the law says so, but because it is the first right thing I have done in 20 years. He sat back down. The courtroom was dead silent. Someone in the back started crying. It was Rosa Chen, her hand covering her mouth. Judge Harlow was quiet for a long time, just writing and thinking, with the whole room hanging on her silence. Then she looked at Jesse. Mr. Hollowell, please stand. Jesse stood up. These children came to you in the middle of a blizzard. You took them in, you fed them, you protected them. You put your reputation, your safety, and your livelihood at risk for 3 little girls who are not your own by blood. She paused. Why? Jesse looked at Eliza, then at Hannah, then at Bertie, who was reaching for him from Lola's lap. Her little arms were stretched out, and the word Papa was forming on her lips. Because somebody had to, he said, and because my brother asked me to, and because, his voice cracked, because I lost a daughter 4 years ago, and I swore I would never love another child again. And then 3 of them showed up at my gate half dead, and they proved me wrong. Judge Harlow studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. In the matter of Eliza May Colton, Hannah Grace Colton, and Bertie Colton, I am awarding full custody to Jesse Wade Hollowell, effective immediately. She brought the gavel down hard. Furthermore, I am ordering a full criminal investigation into Edgar Prescott, the Whitefish Mine, and all associated parties. The gavel came down one last time. The courtroom just erupted. Jesse turned, and Eliza was running toward him. She hit him with her full force, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her face buried in his chest. She was not crying, not yet, just holding on. Hannah stood right behind her, still quiet, still clutching her drawings, but she was looking at Jesse, and for the first time since he had known her, she was smiling. Lola brought Bertie forward. The baby reached for Jesse. He took her. She grabbed his collar with both of her little hands and pressed her face right into his neck. Papa, she said. Home. Jesse held them. All of them. He had Bertie in one arm and Eliza pressed against his chest. Hannah was close enough to touch. Lola was standing right behind them with tears running down her face, her rosary beads clicking softly at her waist. Across the room, Clara Whitfield caught his eye. She just nodded once. That was all. That was enough. Father O'Brien was praying quietly, his lips moving and his eyes closed. And in the back of the courtroom, as the bailiff was leading him away, Edgar Prescott looked back one last time. He looked at the children he had hurt, at the man who had saved them, at the life he had destroyed, and the life he could never have. Then the door closed behind him, and he was gone. Jesse stood there in the middle of the courtroom, holding a dead man's daughters, and hearing the word he thought he would never hear again. And he felt something break wide open inside his chest. It was not grief this time, and it was not rage. It was something else, something he had forgotten even existed. Eliza pulled back and looked up at him with those blue-gray eyes of hers that saw everything. We did it, she said. We did? Is it over? Jesse looked at her, at Hannah, at Bertie. He looked at the family he had found in a blizzard and fought for in a courtroom. A gift he would spend the rest of his days trying to earn. He told her, the hard part is over now. The good part is just getting started. A real smile spread across Eliza's face, full and genuine. It was the first one he'd ever seen from her. It changed everything about her, making her look exactly like what she was. A 9-year-old girl who had finally set down a burden no child should ever have to carry. Can we go home now? She asked. Jesse pulled her in close. Yeah, darling, we can go home. Together they walked out of that courthouse into the crisp air, into the bright light of a February morning that felt like the very first day of something brand new. And for the first time since he laid his own daughter to rest in the hard dirt behind the barn, Jesse Hollowell walked with his head held high, his heart open, and his arms full of children who called him Papa, and truly meant it. The ride home was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence of sorrow or fear. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that settles in after something has been broken wide open, and you don't yet know the shape of the new thing that will grow in its place. Bertie fell fast asleep in Jesse's arms before they even got to the edge of town. Her tiny fist was bunched up in his collar, her breathing was even and slow, her fever was gone, and the bruises were already fading. She was only 3 years old and was already learning that the world could be a safe place again. Hannah sat in the wagon bed with Lola. She was drawing. It was what she always did, of course. But when Jesse glanced back, he saw what she was bringing to life on the paper. It wasn't the man with the belt, or the dark cellar, or any of the shadows from before. She was drawing the courthouse, the judge, and in the very middle of it all, Jesse, with 3 small figures gathered all around him. Eliza rode right beside Jesse on the mare she had already claimed for herself. Her back was straight, her chin was up, and the wind was playing in her hair. She looked like a completely different girl from the one who had stumbled through his gate just 6 weeks ago. It was the same face, the same eyes, but something deep down inside her had shifted. The walls she'd built around herself were still there. They might always be there, but they weren't locked up quite so tight anymore. They finally reached the ranch gate. Jesse swung down from his horse, gently handed Bertie to Lola, and lifted the latch. The old iron didn't stick this time. The hinges didn't groan and cry out. It was a small thing, probably meant nothing, but Jesse noticed it all the same. Eliza hopped down from the mare and just stood there looking at the house. "Mr. Hollowell." "Yeah? Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything, Eliza, you know that." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind rustled her hair, and she pushed it away with a hand that wasn't trembling. "Are you going to change now that it's all official? Now that the judge said we belong to you? Are you going to turn into somebody different?" Jessie looked right at her and understood the real question she was asking. Every grown-up in her life had changed on her. Her daddy went from breathing to buried. Her uncle turned from family into a monster. And the town marshal, the man sworn to protect, became a predator. Folks sure could change, becoming the very thing they'd been hiding all along. "I'm going to try and be better," Jesse said, his voice low. "Every single day. Some days I'll mess it up, but I won't become someone else. I'll stay the man you met that night I pulled Bertie from the snow. Just a fella trying to do what's right and getting it wrong about half the time." Eliza gave him that long, measuring look of hers, the one she used on everybody. Then she gave a slow nod. "Good," she said, "because I like that man. He's not perfect, but he stays." She turned and walked back toward the house. Jesse watched her go. Only 9 years old and already wiser than most folks get in a lifetime. The weeks after the hearing passed like a river, rushing in some parts and slowing to a crawl in others. Edgar Prescott stood trial up in Cheyenne. He pleaded guilty to stealing money, guilty to hurting a child, and guilty to his part in the death of Samuel Colton. The jury only took 40 minutes. The sentence was 12 years in the territorial prison. He would die in there. Everybody knew it. Edgar knew it too, and he accepted it with that same quiet he'd worn in the courtroom. Jesse didn't go to the trial. He didn't need to. Clara went, and so did Father O'Brien and Hart. They came back with the news, a bottle of whiskey, and a firm handshake that spoke volumes. Marshal Dunning was stripped of his badge and charged with helping cover it all up. His brother Jacob was found up in British Columbia, arrested and brought back. The mine was shut down for good. The families of the 12 men who died were found and told. They were given money as restitution. It was not enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. Judge Whitaker resigned his post. He lost his job. He lost his good name. He lost everything but his freedom, which felt wrong to Jesse, but it was something he could not change. Some men just get to fall soft. That's just the way of the world. The town of Elkhorn Creek went on the way small towns do. The gossip turned from suspicion into praise. The same folks who had whispered about a single man raising 3 little girls now showed up with pies, offered to help with chores, and told Jesse they always knew he was a good man. Jesse just let them say it. He didn't believe half of it, but he let them talk because the girls needed to see that a community could be kind. They needed to know people could pick the right side, even if they took their sweet time doing it. Birdie was growing like a weed. That's what happens when a child finally gets enough food, enough hugs, and is told she's loved often enough. She was speaking in full sentences now, stringing words together like she was making a necklace. And most of those words were for Jesse. Papa, look. Papa, come here. Papa, hold me. Papa, the horse is big. Papa, Lola made cookies. Papa, I love you. That last one came out of nowhere on a plain old Tuesday morning. Jesse was lacing up his boots. Birdie was on the floor playing with some wooden blocks Lola had carved for her. She just looked right up at him, smiled a big smile, and said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. I love you, Papa. Jesse's hands just stopped, frozen on the laces. His eyes got blurry. He blinked hard, trying to clear them. I love you too, Birdie. She just went right back to her blocks. The conversation was over. There was no big dramatic moment, no swelling music. It was just a 3-year-old girl speaking a truth she'd felt for weeks and had finally found the words for. Jesse finished with his boots, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He drank it standing by the window, with tears rolling right down his face and not a single reason in the world to wipe them away. Lola found him there. She took one look at him and didn't ask a thing. The coffee's too strong, Jesse mumbled. It's the same coffee I've been making for 20 years, Mr. Hollowell. Must be the altitude, then, he said. Lola just smiled, patted his arm, and went back to making her bread. Hannah's silence stretched on. Weeks rolled into months, and she still hadn't spoken a word. Jesse worried. Lola worried. Clara Whitfield came by every week to check on her, and she left each time with that careful look on her face that said, be patient, but also said she was concerned. Eliza didn't seem to worry, or at least she never let it show. Hannah will talk when she is ready, Eliza told Jesse. You cannot rush it. She has been holding all that bad stuff inside for so long. She has to figure out how to let it go again. She paused for a moment. The drawings are helping. Look at them. I mean, really look at them. So Jesse did. He spread all 47 drawings out on his desk one evening. He put them in order by the date they were made and saw exactly what Eliza was talking about. The first ones were dark, drawn with heavy charcoal and angry lines. There was the man with the belt, the dark cellar, the broken wrist. It was fear, drawn in black on brown paper. But then, slowly, they started to change. The lines got softer. Color started to show up. Lola had given Hannah some colored pencils, and that little girl used them like she was learning a whole new language. Green for the grass, blue for the sky, yellow for Birdie's hair, brown for the horses, for... The people in the drawings changed too. The man with the belt vanished around drawing number 23. In his place was a tall figure wearing a cowboy hat. It was Jesse, standing between the small figures of the girls and whatever was just out of sight, protecting them. Not with his fists, but just by being there. The very last drawing in the pile was different. It was bigger and had more detail. Hannah had worked on it for 3 whole days. It was a picture of the ranch, the house, the barn, the fence line. And there in the yard were 5 people. Jesse, Eliza, Hannah herself, Birdie, and Lola. They were all holding hands. Down at the bottom, in letters that were getting surer and more steady, Hannah had written 3 words. This is home. Jesse put the drawings back in their proper order and placed them in a box. He put that box in the bottom drawer of his desk, the very same drawer where he used to keep his whiskey. The whiskey was long gone. He hadn't touched a drop since the night Bertie first called him Papa. He didn't need it anymore. He had found something better, something that filled up that same empty space inside, but didn't leave him hollow in the morning. April finally arrived, and with it came the first real thaw. The snow melted off, and the creek started running full. The valley changed from white to brown and then to the first light touch of green. The cattle that had made it through the winter were thin, but they were alive. The ranch would make it. It would just take time. Everything worth having takes time. On a Saturday morning in the middle of April, Jesse was out fixing the fence in the north pasture. Eliza was right there with him. She held the post steady while he hammered in the nails. They worked in a comfortable quiet, the kind that settles between people who know each other's ways without having to talk about it. "Mr. Hollowell," Eliza said, "we've talked about this. You can call me Jessie." "I know." Eliza took the hammer and drove a nail herself, straight and true, getting stronger every day. "But I like Mr. Hollowell. It feels right." She stopped for a second. "Maybe someday I will call you something else when I am ready." Jesse understood completely. He did not push it. Someday was good enough. Someday was a promise of more time, more days, more fence posts to fix, and more quiet to share together. They were walking back toward the house when Jesse spotted a rider coming up the road from town. He was moving at a steady pace, not too fast and not too slow. It was the pace of a man who'd been on the road a long time and was finally close to where he was going. Jesse stopped in his tracks. His hand went to his hip out of pure habit. He wasn't carrying a gun. He hadn't worn one since the girls arrived. He didn't want weapons in a house full of children. Eliza raised a hand to shield her eyes from the sun. "Who is that?" "I do not know." The rider came closer. He was a man in his 30s with dark hair, a lean build, and a coat covered in the dust of many days on the trail. He pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet from the gate. He looked at Jesse, then at Eliza, and then his eyes scanned the whole ranch. Then he slowly took off his hat. And that's when Jesse saw his face. He saw the line of his jaw, his eyes, the way he carried himself. It was like looking in a mirror that showed you how you might have turned out if life had taken you down a different road. Jesse couldn't find his voice. The man swung down from his horse, slow and careful. He stood there holding his hat in both hands, looking nervous and unsure, a grown man who looked like a boy hoping he'd come to the right place. "I got your telegram," the man said. "Took me a while. I had to make sure it was safe to travel." He took a short breath. "I'm Nathan. Nathan Hollowell. Though I have not used that name in 9 years." Jesse just stared at his cousin, the boy he had grown up with, the boy his family had mourned. The boy who was supposed to be dead and buried back in Virginia was standing right here in his yard, alive. He was weathered by time, carrying 9 years of hiding in the lines around his eyes. "Nathan," Jesse finally said. The name felt both strange and familiar, like a shirt you hadn't worn in ages that somehow still fit perfectly. Nathan looked at him. "Uncle Matthew always said you were the most stubborn man in Wyoming. Said you'd argue with a fence post and win." A small, faint smile touched Nathan's lips. Then his face turned serious again. "I came because of Samuel, because of what he asked me to do. I was there, Jesse, at that mine. I saw what happened. I saw Dunning kill that man. I saw them bury the truth." His voice dropped. "I ran, just like Samuel did. Just like... But I never stopped being afraid." "You do not have to be afraid anymore," Jesse said, his own voice steady. "Dunning is in custody. Edgar is in prison. The mine is shut down." Nathan looked like a man who'd been carrying a massive boulder up a steep hill and was just told he could finally set it down. "It's really over?" "It is really over." Nathan's chin fell to his chest. His shoulders began to shake. He stood there in the middle of the yard and cried, the way men do when they've had to be strong for far too long. And finally, that strength is no longer needed. Jesse went over to him, put his hand on his cousin's shoulder, and just held it there, solid and steady, the way he had learned from Eliza. It wasn't about fixin' or talking, just about being there. After a minute, Nathan wiped his face and looked over at Eliza. This must be Samuel's girl. Eliza was watching Nathan the same way she watched everyone. Taking his measure, figuring him out, but her gaze was softer now, the edges not nearly so sharp. I'm Eliza. Papa told me about you. Said you were brave. Nathan let out a laugh, but it was a wet, broken sound. Brave? I've spent 9 years hiding up in Canada. There ain't nothing brave about that. Eliza just shrugged her little shoulders. You came back here, didn't you? That's brave enough. Nathan looked back at Jesse. She's just like Samuel. Got that same way about her, making you feel like you can do just about anything. Jesse nodded. She gets that from her father. Now come on inside. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in a week. They all gathered around the big kitchen table. The whole family. Jesse, Nathan, Eliza, Lola, and Bertie, who was sitting in Jesse's lap, picking biscuit crumbs off his shirt. In the corner, Hannah was drawing. Nathan started to tell his story. He talked about the mine, the killing, and the 9 long years of running. He spoke of the small towns, the made-up names, and the kind of loneliness that just eats you alive from the inside out, when you can't tell a single soul who you really are or what you're afraid of. He told it all real simple, without any extra drama. It was the way men tell the hardest stories when they're finally done carrying them alone, just plain worn out from the weight of them. Once he was done, Lola refilled his coffee cup. Eliza started asking questions, sharp ones, the kind a lawyer might ask, and Nathan answered every last one. Jesse looked at him straight and asked, Will you stand up in court against Dunning's brother? Will you tell them what you saw? Nathan stayed quiet for a long spell, just staring at the coffee mug in his hands, watching the steam curl up into the warm kitchen air, taking in the sight of the children. Yes, he finally said. I'll testify. I'm through with hiding. He met Jesse's eyes. Samuel died because he was brave enough to speak the truth. The very least I can do is see it through. Jesse gave a slow nod, feeling something settle deep inside him, like a circle was finally closing. A debt was being paid, not to the law and not to the dead, but to Samuel, to the brother who put his trust in him one last time, and was right to do so. That night, after Nathan was settled in a spare room and the girls were tucked into bed, the whole house fell quiet. Jesse sat out on the front porch. The sky was clear as glass, with stars so thick they looked like spilled sugar. The air was still cold, but it wasn't a mean cold, not the kind that freezes you to the bone. It was just crisp enough to make you feel alive with every breath. And that's when Eliza came out and sat down next to him. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. It was Lola's, the one that always smelled like cinnamon and cedar wood. They sat there for a good while, not saying a word. It was the easy kind of quiet that happens between folks who don't need words to understand what's important. Mr. Hollowell, Eliza said after a time. Yep. Do you reckon Papa knows we're all right? That you kept your promise to him? Jesse looked up at the night sky, at all those stars and the whole impossible vastness of the universe hanging over them. I'd like to think he does, and sometimes just believing a thing is enough to make it so. Eliza leaned her head on his shoulder, a small, warm weight. It wasn't a burden, but an anchor, something that kept him tied to this world when the grief and the guilt tried to pull him away. I stopped sleeping with a knife, she said, her voice soft. Jesse sat up a little straighter. When? Last week, after the court hearing. She took a breath. I woke up in the middle of the night and my hand went right for it, but then I thought I don't need this anymore. so I put it away in the drawer and went right back to sleep. A lump formed in Jesse's throat. He put his arm around her and pulled her in close. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard, Eliza. Braver than walking through any blizzard. A whole lot braver. She smiled against his shoulder. Can I tell you something else? Always. Hannah talked today. Jesse turned to look right at her. What did you say? This afternoon, when you were out mending the fence. Birdie just took her pencil, snatched it right out of her hand, and Hannah, Eliza's voice trembled a little. Hannah said, "Give it back, Birdie. That is mine." 4 words, Jesse whispered. 5, Eliza corrected. 5 words. The first she said in 8 months. Jesse covered his eyes with his hand and just breathed for a moment. What did you do? Nothing. I didn't want to scare her off or make a big fuss. I just looked at her, and she looked back at me. Then she went back to her drawing, and Birdie handed the pencil back, and that was it. That was it, Jesse repeated. That was everything, Eliza whispered. They stayed on the porch as the night got deeper. The stars wheeled across the sky, and the cold crept in closer, but it couldn't touch them. They were together, and being together was warm enough. Inside the house, Nathan was sleeping in a proper bed for the first time in ages. Lola had left a candle lit in his window, just like she used to for Jesse after Rosie passed. It was a small light against the dark, her way of saying, "You are not alone here." And in their room, Hannah and Birdie were asleep, all tangled up like they always were. Birdie's little hand was lost in Hannah's hair, and Hannah's arm was wrapped around Birdie's waist. On the nightstand sat Hannah's newest drawing. It showed 5 stick figures standing in front of a house, all holding hands. And written at the bottom, in letters far steadier than they had ever been, were 5 words that changed the whole world. This is my family now. Morning broke warmer than it had been since January. Jesse woke up to the sound of laughter. It was Birdie's bright, bubbly giggle, and Eliza's, which was a rare and wonderful thing to hear. And underneath them both, quiet but clear as a bell, was Hannah, laughing. A sound no one in that house had ever heard. Jesse just lay there in bed, listening. He let the sound wash over him, letting it fill up the rooms that had felt empty for 4 long years. He let it chase the dust of old grief out of all the dark corners. He got up, pulled on his clothes, and walked to the kitchen. They were all in there. Lola was at the stove flipping pancakes. Eliza was setting the table. Hannah was already drawing at her spot, a colored pencil in each hand. Birdie was on the floor trying her hardest to shove Jesse's big boot onto her tiny foot and failing spectacularly. Nathan was at the table with a mug of coffee, just watching the happy mess with the look of a man who had forgotten what a family sounded like and was remembering it all in a rush. Jessie stood in the doorway for a moment, just taking it all in. Birdie spotted him first. Her face broke into a grin so big it looked like it might split her clean in 2. "Papa?" she squealed, holding up the boot. "Too big." "Way too big," Jesse agreed. "Give it about 15 more years." He walked over to the table and sat down. Lola slid a plate in front of him. Eliza poured his coffee without him having to ask. She knew just how he liked it. Black, hot, and no sugar. She'd picked that up his first week there and never forgot it. Hannah glanced up from her drawing, looked right at Jesse, and said, "Good morning." 2 words, spoken so softly you could barely hear them. But they landed in that kitchen like a thunderclap. It was like the whole house had been holding its breath for 8 months and had finally, all at once, let it out. Lola dropped the spatula with a clatter, crossed herself, and started crying right into the pancake batter. Eliza's eyes welled up, but she wouldn't let the tears fall. She just gave her sister a smile, the kind that said, "I knew you could do it. I always knew." Nathan quickly looked away, swiping at his face with his sleeve, pretending he wasn't crying into his coffee. Jesse just looked at Hannah. He looked at this 6-year-old girl who had gone silent because words had been turned into weapons in Edgar Prescott's house. A girl who had spent 8 months saying everything she needed to with charcoal and paper, who had finally found her voice again in a kitchen that smelled of pancakes and coffee, and the special kind of warmth that comes from people who choose to be a family. "Good morning, Hannah," Jesse said, and his voice was perfectly steady, even though everything inside him was shaking. Hannah looked at him and looked him square in the eye for a good long while. Then she turned back to her drawing, but the corner of her mouth hitched up. It was not a full smile, just the start of one. The little seed that promised more words were on their way. And after that, laughter. And maybe someday, the whole voice of a little girl who finally remembered it was safe to speak, because the folks around her would never twist her words to hurt her. Jesse ate his breakfast and drank his coffee, just listening to the sounds of 5 people in a kitchen that was built for one. He let the noise fill up the empty spaces. He let it change him. He let it do the one thing that the whiskey, the silence, and 4 long years of grieving never could. It made him whole. After breakfast, Jesse stepped out onto the porch. The valley was green as could be. The snow was all gone except for a little bit on the highest peaks. The cattle were grazing in the very same fields that nearly took him 3 months ago. Life was coming back just the way life always does, stubborn and relentless, refusing to stay down for long. Eliza came out and stood right beside him. "Mr. Hollowell?" "Yeah." She was quiet for a second. Then she took his hand, her small fingers weaving through his, the same way Rosie used to do when they'd walk to the barn. The way a child holds on to the one person in the whole world they trust the most. "Thank you," Eliza said, "for that first night, and for all the nights that came after." Jesse squeezed her hand. He could not find the words to speak, but he did not need to. They stood there together, watching the valley come to life, watching the sunlight spread out over the land, watching the world prove that even after the worst winter anyone could remember, spring still showed up. It always did. A person just had to be strong enough to hold on and see it. Behind them, the house was full of life. Lola was singing in Spanish, Birdie was laughing, Hannah was drawing, and Nathan was telling the story about a bear he'd met in British Columbia, the one Birdie made him tell over and over. They were a family, broken and rebuilt, scarred up but healing, not perfect but here. And they were more than Jesse Hollowell ever figured he deserved. He had buried his daughter, lost his brother, and spent 4 years turning his own heart to stone. Then 3 little girls wandered out of a blizzard and proved that the heart he thought was dead had only been sleeping. It was just waiting for someone brave enough to come and wake it up. Eliza leaned her head against his arm. "Papa would be proud of you," she said. Jesse looked down at her, at this fierce, wise, and impossibly strong child. She had carried her sisters through a blizzard, carried a dead man's letter in her boot, and carried the weight of a family on shoulders that were way too small for the job. But she did it anyway. "Your papa would be proud of you too," he said. "Prouder than any man has ever been." "Of any daughter." Eliza smiled. A real one this time. The kind of smile that made her look like what she was. A kid. Just a kid. Finally getting the chance to be one. "I know," she said. "He told me so in his letter. The one he wrote just for me. The one I have not shown anybody." Jesse did not ask to see it. He did not need to. Some things between a father and his daughter are sacred, even when the father is gone, especially when he is gone. The sun climbed up higher in the sky. The day opened itself up, all warm and green, and filled with the kind of promise you only find in a Wyoming spring. Jesse Hollowell stood on his porch with his brother's daughter holding his hand, his cousin at his table, and his house full of the sounds of children. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had found the very thing he'd spent 4 years pretending he did not need. This was not a second chance. Second chances were for folks who thought the first one was all used up. This was something else entirely, something that did not have a name. It was something that started with a blizzard and a baby who said Papa. It started with a 9-year-old girl who slept with a knife and a 6-year-old who drew the truth when she could not speak it. It was something that looked like 3 little girls and sounded like laughter. And it felt like coming home after being lost so long you forgot what home even was. Jessie gave Eliza's hand a little squeeze. She squeezed right back, and that was enough. That was more than enough. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.